In a recent study done of non-Christians in the United States, 84% said they knew at least one Christian personally, but only 15% of that group thought that that believer's lifestyle was significantly different than their own. Paul's main point in Romans 2, which we're going to study today, is that religion by itself, apart from the gospel, is powerless to change people's lives. If anything, it makes them worse. Paul's main point at the end of chapter 1, if you recall, was that every human being ever born has this in common. They have rejected God, either by despising his glory or disobeying him. And Paul knows that many people at that point are going to say, well, yeah, but isn't that where religion comes in to make us better? Specifically, he knows that a lot of his Jewish readers listened to chapter 1 and thought, well, yeah, Paul, those ungodly Romans are pretty messed up. You tell them. It's a good thing we have the Jewish religion, the Jewish laws to keep us straight. So in Romans 2, Paul unpacks why religion, apart from Christ, cannot help us. Religious obedience, he's going to say, is just a thin veneer of righteousness that is papered over a heart that is every bit as sinful as the biggest pagan in the world. Religion by itself is powerless to change the loves of our hearts. It might clean up our behaviors a little bit on the outside, but it cannot transform our hearts on the inside. By the way, I think this will help you. Every time you see Paul use the word law in this chapter, just read that as any religious rule. Whatever commands you're trying to obey to be a good person. And every time you see the word Jew in this chapter, just substitute religious person for that, because that's who Paul is really talking about here. Paul is showing us that any religious devotion, apart from Christ, is powerless to correct the problem of human sinfulness. The law, religious laws of whatever type, cannot change our hearts. Look at the first verse, therefore. Now that word therefore indicates that Paul is pointing backwards to chapter 1. He's saying, because the posture of every human heart is one of rejection of God, every one of you, he says, who judges is also without excuse. For when you judge another, you condemn yourself, since you, the judge, do the same things that those pagans do. Paul's saying, you religious people, you think you're better because you know the Bible and you've curbed some of your sinful behavior, but God sees your heart. And you may never have bowed down to an idol, but you have treasured other things in your heart more than God. You may not have committed adultery with your body, but you have committed it in your heart. You may never have physically murdered somebody, but you've hated them in your heart and you've wished for their harm. Your heart, religious person, just like that of a non-religious person, is drawn to disobedience, Paul says. And truth is, you try to get away with things every place you can. If we look closely at your thoughts and your words and your actions, we're not going to see somebody who from the heart loves God and desires his commands. We're going to see somebody who is drawn to sin. And be assured, Paul says, verse 6, God will repay each one according to his works. Verse 7, giving eternal life to those who by persistence in doing good seek glory, honor, and immortality. In other words, you're not just doing righteous things, you're doing righteous things because you love God. You're actually seeking those things. Verse 8, he says, but he's going to give wrath and anger to those who are self-seeking and disobey the truth. Paul is saying that it's not merely doing right that counts with God. You have to do right for the right reason. Now, really quickly, some people read verse 6 and they get confused, where Paul says God is going to repay each one according to his works, eternal life to those who persist in doing good. And they say, well, it sounds like Paul is saying that we save ourselves by our good works. Didn't Paul just get done explaining in chapter 1 that salvation cannot be earned through good works, but it's given as a gift by faith alone? Yeah, great question. I'm glad you're paying attention. Paul is not saying in verse 6 that some people can be good enough to escape the curse of sin. His point is that God judges the heart, and that while some people give an external show of religion that's impressive, internally they're still filled with wickedness. If they did live righteous enough to merit heaven, live that way from the heart, God would not withhold heaven from them, but none of them actually do. External practices of religion, he's telling these religious people, do not equal inward transformation. That's his main point here. And when it's all said and done, on that final day, God is going to look beyond the outward performance of our lives to the inward motivations of our hearts. And some works that look really good on the surface are not really going to look that good when you really get down to the motives for why they were done. That's what he's saying there in verses 6 and 7. Quick little illustration of this. Charles Spurgeon told a story about an ancient English king who one day had a carrot farmer show up in his court with a huge carrot, biggest carrot that the king had ever seen. And this poor little farmer said, "Oh, king, when I harvested this carrot, I knew that it was deserving of a king. So I'm bringing it to you to honor you. You've been a great king. You've been just and you've been fair, and your laws have helped me prosper. And so I want to give this to you as an offering to say I'm thankful." Well, the king was moved by this offering, and he said, "You know, I happen to own all the land next to your little farm. I'm going to give you 300 more acres." Well, one of the king's noblemen was standing there, and he thought, wow, if the king would give 300 acres in response to a carrot, imagine what he'd give in response to a real gift. So that night, the nobleman went out and bought the finest horse he could find in all of England. And he trotted it in the next day to the king's court and said, "Oh, king, when I saw this horse, I knew it was deserving of a king, and I want to give it to you from your humble servant." Well, the king, who was pretty wise and knew that the nobleman was giving the horse to him only to get something from him, said, "Yesterday, the carrot farmer was giving the carrot to me. Today, you are giving the horse to yourself." Doing good deeds is not enough, Paul says. You have to do them for the right reason. Good deeds done to earn heaven or to get blessings or obtain rewards from God, or good deeds that are done to impress others, they don't really count as good in the eyes of God because they're selfishly motivated. Paul says only good works that come from the right heart counts with God. Paul is saying, his point in all of this is that when you look closer at the religious heart, what you're going to see is that a lot of people who did really righteous things didn't do them out of love for God. They did them out of love for something else. Furthermore, Paul says nobody has ever even lived up to their own righteous standards. No matter what they said about their lives, if you look closely, they didn't live up to their own righteous standards, whatever they were. Our problem, Paul explains in verses 12 through 24, is not that we don't know enough about the law. It's that we don't obey the parts we do know. Paul in verse 14 says that even the Gentiles who've never seen a Bible, they still have a law, one that God wrote on their hearts. Even though they've never read a Bible, they have a sense of what is right and wrong, and they fail to live up to that standard of right and wrong. Francis Schaeffer had a great little illustration for this. He said, imagine you had a little recorder around your neck, invisible, that only recorded you when you said the word ought or should. Whenever you said he ought to, she ought to, they should, I should, and then on Judgment Day, God judged you only by the things that you said that others ought to have done or should do. All of us, Francis Schaeffer said, would stand condemned by our own standard. Our problem is not fundamentally an ignorance problem, it's an obedience problem. All of us fail to live up to whatever standards we espouse for what a good person is. Furthermore, Paul says, far from correcting the problem, religion, when we get fervent in it, usually just makes us worse. It makes us proud, hypocritical, and judgmental. In chapter 2, Paul identifies 3 negative qualities that religion without the gospel produces in people. The first one is a critical spirit. Religious people are quick to pass judgment. Verse 1, religious people are quick to find faults in others because, well, they do that naturally because they want to show that they're better than others. A religious person's whole strategy for being accepted by God is being better than other people. So they're quick to find fault and pass judgment on others. Hypocrisy is the second negative thing Paul points to in verse 21. He says, you, the ones who teach and judge, you practice the very same things that you forbid in others. Religion makes people hide their faults, sometimes even hiding them from themselves. That's because inwardly they need to maintain this outward appearance of togetherness, while inwardly, raging in their heart are the very sinful passions they despise in others. And often in secret, when nobody sees, they practice the very same things. Insecurity, that's your third negative thing that religion produces that Paul points to. At the root of these things, surprisingly, is insecurity. Religious people are insecure that they've been accepted by God. And because of that, they always have this nagging question, have I done enough? And that makes us insecure, which makes us more critical and more hypocritical. The whole premise of religion, which is if I obey enough, I will be accepted, leads not to healing, it leads to despair and pride and hypocrisy and hate and all the other bad things that go along with that. The law cannot heal our sinfulness. It can't remove our insecurity. It can only reveal our sinfulness. The law is like railroad tracks. It points you in the direction that you should go, but it is powerless to move the freight along the tracks. What we need, Paul says, is heart change. You see, this is a big theme in Romans. God is not just looking for obedience. He's looking for a whole new kind of obedience, an obedience that grows out of desire, an obedience that comes instinctively, an obedience where you seek righteousness because you crave righteousness, an obedience where you pursue God because you love God, not because you're commanded to. That kind of change can't come from the law, no matter how perfect that law is. Paul's conclusion, verse 28, for a person is not a Jew or a Christian who is one outwardly, and true circumcision is not something visible in the flesh. Verse 29, circumcision is of the heart, by the Spirit, not the letter. Circumcision was an outward sign of the Jewish covenant. In those days, before modern standards of cleanliness, not being circumcised led to a lot of disease. So in circumcision, you were removing a source of filthiness at the very point of new life. That's all I'm going to say about that, all right? If you don't understand it, ask your group leader later. I'm sure they would love to explain all this to you in more detail. But Paul's point is, just like inward resolution to do better can't change the human heart, neither can religious rituals. Religious rituals, like circumcision, are external things unable to change the true nature of the heart. No religious ritual, not baptism, not communion, not going to church, not taking a pilgrimage, not circumcision. No religious ritual can change your heart. To change the heart, we need something more powerful than religion. We need inward transforming grace. And that change cannot come from the law, from more instructions about what we ought to do. What we need is the power to do it. And that can only come from what Paul says is a circumcision, not of the flesh, but of the heart. And that's only given by the gospel and the power of the Spirit. So here's my question I want us to end with. How are you attempting to change your heart? Maybe you're in this study because you think you just need to buckle down and try harder. How many times do you have to go through this process of inward resolution to change only to be followed by frustration and failure before you're ready to receive the truth that you can't change yourself? Only God can change you. Friend, religion won't work. Whatever religion you're talking about, only the gospel, which turns religion on its head, only the gospel can. Our only hope is the transforming power of Christ through the cross and resurrection. More on that in chapter 3.